Gala, one of their loudest advocates made a statement with her dress. New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez showed up with the slogan, "Tax the Rich," emblazoned on her gown. Everyone had a good laugh about it. The rich were, after all, right there at the party with her, and she didn't get her invitation because they actually believe she's any threat to them. Give the Congresswoman this credit. She knows her business is show business. But that isn't the only statement she made with her couture. It isn't even the most important one. The most enduring and significant message sent by AOC that night, and by all the Met Gala attendees, was the one embedded in the photograph she gladly shared with the press. The New York Times ran one of them, heading a story entitled "AOC's Met Gala Dress Triggered Strong Reactions." There you see a beaming AOC, isn't she clever, isn't she arch, modeling her dress as a masked attendant kneels on the floor, smoothing out the fit. The Times story notes that a masked aide held up the train of her dress while she smiled brightly and waved at her fans. She sent a message, said Vogue. But it wasn't the message she, the Met Gala attendees, the New York Times, or Vogue intended. It certainly wasn't one they recognized or understood. Years from now, when we look back at the Met Gala of 2021, we won't remember the exhortation to tax the rich. It's a tired slogan, literally centuries of history to it, and its invocation now will evaporate when the moment does. What we'll remember is the masked men and women who appear nameless, faceless, expressionless, thankless, in the background of the lives of the elites, on the fringes of their decadent celebrations. They're kneeling on the floor, they're fitting the clothes, they're serving the food, they're pouring the wine, they're working. While the powerful, the rich, the celebrities, the politicians party and delight in their unearned guilt and glitter, they're working. These Americans are working while their rulers have made them hide their faces. They've made them hide their faces with the excuse of a public health and a bygone crisis, all the better to make the rest of us look at them as they party and preen. It isn't just the Met Gala. It isn't just AOC. You can see the awful spectacle of unmasked and free elites served as they dine or celebrate or shop by masked working Americans nearly everywhere these days. You can see it in high-end restaurants. You can see it at catered events. You can see it in the cities where the rich gather and the poor work, and there is less and less middle class to speak of. They're all blue cities, of course: San Francisco, New York, Austin, Washington, D.C. Last month, Anthony Fauci, Pope of Science, was spotted hobnobbing at a book party for ABC's Jonathan Karl at Washington's Cafe Milano. He was pulling his mask off and on as he moved through the crowd, and reportedly explained this by telling DC Society maven Sally Quinn, who once penned an erotic novel about a Fauci-inspired character back before everyone in the authoritarian left was doing it every day, that "I just decided that if anyone came up that I didn't know, I would put my mask on." This was during a citywide mask mandate, by the way. But Fauci had nothing to worry about. It's not like anyone would arrest him or that he would know any of the help. The masks are for them, after all. On the precipice of the year of our Lord 2022, with the COVID-19 pandemic entering its third year, this is what the panic and politics of the disease has brought us: a house divided. Measures that might have made sense in early 2020, when there was no good understanding of the sickness, no vaccines, no therapies, no experience as a guide, make no sense now. In early 2020, nearly the entire nation was willing to do its part to beat an onrushing plague by enduring lockdowns, masking up, socially distancing, and more. We're Americans, and pulling together is what we do, after all. But because we're Americans, we have expectations of our representatives, our leadership, and our institutions. When they keep faith, we honor their demands of us, not because we are ruled, but because we are citizens. When they don't keep faith, well, we kick them to the curb, or we ought to. The years of the pandemic have sharply illuminated the bad faith, incompetence, and dim-wittedness of those representatives, that leadership, and these institutions. Tomorrow is New Year's Eve, otherwise known as Day 655 of 15 days to slow the spread. And it's safe to say at this point that nearly the whole formal apparatus of American civic life has written for itself a record of failure in response to COVID-19. The pandemic, which is, make no mistake, serious, deserving of public attention, has advanced and receded according to its own logic and imperatives, nearly impervious to any public policy decreed by our hapless leadership. Travel bans haven't worked. Mask mandates haven't worked. Lockdowns haven't worked. Social distancing hasn't worked. The entirety of an incompetent public health and epidemiological apparatus has not worked. The whole toolkit of ham-fisted government has not worked. About the only thing that has worked reasonably well is the American pharmaceutical sector. If you're comfortable getting vaccinated, well, Moderna designed its COVID-19 vaccine in just 2 days in January 2020. If you don't want to get vaccinated, there are an array of effective therapies, from new pills to monoclonal antibodies, coming rapidly onto the market. If you don't feel comfortable with the vaccines or those therapies, well, there are reasonably accurate tests you can take to let you know if you even have COVID-19. American citizens and American private enterprise have responded well to this pandemic. But the American government's role in all of this has been mostly to delay, suppress, or create artificial scarcities with all these things. It's almost as if, heaven forbid, the ruling class wants this pandemic to continue. They couldn't actually want that, could they? In the places where that class is gripped its tightest, the pandemic's theater continues its dreadful run. It's impossible to miss the political contours as we tip into the 2022 midterm year. Call up any presidential election map of the past 20 years, and you'll see it immediately. The red states are generally the ones where they don't make Americans wear masks and where they don't make Americans receive vaccines. Americans are free to do both, of course, in all those states, but they're not forced to, and that's the essential point now. It is the blue states where you see the opposite. A blue state isn't simply shorthand for democratic control. It signifies rule by an intersection of media, academic, plutocratic, and cultural elites over a citizenry that either welcomes that rule or is too cowed or disempowered to do anything about it. It is these states, New York, Illinois, California, Oregon, Washington, New Mexico, and beyond, where we see the statewide compulsions to receive a vaccine. It is these states where we see the statewide compulsion to wear a mask. It is also these states where we see no significant empirical difference in pandemic outcomes versus a free state like Florida or Texas. So why do they persist? Now that we are moving into pandemic year 3, now that we've tried everything and found it all lacking, now that we know every citizen is going to make his own decision on risk, on prevention, on treatment, why in 2022 do they double down on the 2020 toolkit? Do they not understand events? Have they learned nothing? If only it were that simple. If only it was a mere case of governing elite stupidity. If only it was their characteristic incapacity in grasping events. It's something much worse. You must understand it because it is the difference between your future as a citizen and a different future as a subject. They persist in the masking, in the lockdowns, in the travel bans, in the coercion because it expresses and enables their rule. Period. Full stop. The masked, anonymous drones holding the train of a progressive superstar's party gown is exactly what they want Americans to be. Stripping identity is what they do these days, whether it's poisoning your children against America in the public schools, tearing down monuments of our founders, or erasing your face from public view while their own bright smiles beam in the limelight. We are a house divided on this cusp of a new year. In one America, the free America, families are gathered. There are New Year's parties. Loved ones share time and memories. Communities thrive. Children learn in person, and life goes on. Despite the shadow of COVID, every person assessing risk and acting accordingly. In the other America, the unfree America, a neurotic fixation atomizes communities, pulls families apart, perpetrates child abuse with remote schooling and mandatory masking, curbs the worship of God, forces medical procedures on the pain of ostracism and unemployment, and subjects absolutely everyone to the capricious rule of an unqualified elite. There, Americans are reduced to anonymized servitude, cogs in the machine of the state, masked and cloistered and kept alone in their apartments, with no end in sight. It is not a regrettable necessity. It is the desired outcome of the authoritarian left. It is their vision for the future. The people get their money from the government, their food delivered to the door, their marching orders from social media, their instruction via Zoom, their entertainment from the Oculus Rift. As Father John Misty sang, the future's definition is so much higher than it was last year. You might be wondering why this miserable system is the goal of the authoritarian left. The simplest answer is because they think they know better than you. We are ruled by mediocrities, people who could never thrive in private industry, technocrats who believe they can central plan us into a better future, even as all the evidence around us suggests they're planning us into oblivion. You need to wake up to this reality. And now that you are awake, you need to fight. A house divided against itself, after all, cannot stand. Joining me now to respond is former Education Secretary Bill Bennett. Bill, thank you so much for taking the time to join me this evening. I am concerned about the direction that we're going. We've heard the trope of two Americas over and over again from politicians, but nothing like this past year and the experience under this divided rule has made us reach this point like anything before in my lifetime. How do we get back to not being a house divided?
Well, we're getting back. By the way, nice pedigree. House divided, Matthew 12:25 to Abraham Lincoln to Ben Domenech. I like that. That's a nice line of succession you're in, Ben. We are getting back. We're fighting back. We're waking up. We were dazed. We were knocked against the ropes. We weren't sure what hit us. And as you point out, in the early days of COVID, we didn't know what to do. We weren't sure about this. Now we've learned a lot. You know, Václav Havel, another great statesman like Lincoln, our greatest statesman, crisis of the house divided, Havel said, you know, we were living a lie in the old communist Czech Republic, old communist Czech country. He said, because they wouldn't let us live the truth. Because if we lived the truth, they would all know that it was a lie, and everyone would then act. And so it was important to suppress the truth, Havel writes. And so we've seen the effort, Ben, to suppress the truth through some of these high-tech operations and elsewhere. But what we need to do, it seems to me more than anything else, Ben, is engage in what the author, novelist Tom Wolfe called the great relearning. We have forgotten some of the first things that we need to now remember. That schools are there to teach children how to read and write and count and think. And by the way, the children come first, not last. They've been a very neglected group over the last couple of years. Second, that we're a sovereign nation. We have borders, and they matter. Third, that with the protection the government offers to every citizen, safety is the first object of government, Federalist Papers say, comes freedom, and freedom for those individuals. The American people are now waking up. I don't know if Loudoun County, Virginia will be, you know, the Lexington and Concord of this revolution, but things are stirring. And I think the great relearning is taking place. The American people are saying, we're not taking this anymore. We don't believe you.
I would like to ask you, as a former education secretary, what you would say right now to those families, frustrated, tired, who have learned in the last several weeks that many of the school systems that they were depending on being open, sending their kids back to in-person learning, are even now entertaining the prospect of being closed for God knows how long. You saw, I'm sure, the vote among the Chicago Teachers Union. Sure. In terms of Virginia's Arlington schools, similar things are happening across the country. What would you say to those parents about what they ought to do in such a situation?
You know, the first thing I would think about is see if you can go elsewhere. If this is the kind of regard they have for you and your children, knowing the circumstance it puts you in as a parent, particularly a single parent, and what this distance learning does for most children, they must not have much regard for you. Think about homeschooling. Think about a charter school. Think about sending your child elsewhere. Again, we have seen the lie, and the lie is that we care more about your children than anyone else. No, they don't. If they did, they would be there, and they would be there, in person. The one more thing I want to say is, it's a great essay by Hannah Arendt in which she talks about a lot of things. One of them is surrender. There's a certain kind of surrender, Ben, we are not allowed to practice in front of the young. We cannot surrender ourselves, we cannot surrender our liberty, our freedom, and we cannot surrender them. Find the best education you can for your child that you can provide. Hopefully, the Supreme Court's on the way with more decisions that will favor educational choice and support educational choice so that money follows the student wherever the student may go. This may be the educational shakeup we need. But I do think the great relearning is beginning. I think it's beginning in earnest. When you talk to people around the country, citizens, those subjects are becoming citizens, to use your nice phrase there. I think you can see sign of this, and people are tired of surrendering to the experts who have been so wrong. Just one last thing: when the head of CDC says, "Well, we thought 10 days for lockup, would be proper, but we decided to go with 5 because we think that's all that the public could bear." Well, that ain't science. That's policy, and that's what they've been making all along.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bill Bennett, for joining me this evening.
Thank you, Ben.
Coming up, a top health commissioner says the quiet part out loud. They're exaggerating the COVID numbers just to scare you.
The numbers that we gave on pediatric admissions, it really is to motivate pediatricians and families to seek the protection of vaccines.
The number of COVID cases is growing faster than ever, and the so-called experts won't let that crisis go to waste. Listen to New York Health Commissioner Dr. Mary Bassett, who admitted this week they've been exaggerating an upward trend in child hospitalizations to essentially terrify parents into getting their kids vaccinated.
The numbers that we gave on pediatric admissions weren't intended to make it seem that children were having an epidemic of infection. It really is to motivate pediatricians and families to seek the protection of vaccination.
Joining me now, John Davidson, senior editor at The Federalist. This whole dynamic of people who have been pushing the idea that people need to get their kids vaccinated, using this type of approach that seems to exaggerate these hospitalizations, it really seems to me to be something that undermines faith in the entire institutions in question.
It's also absolutely appalling to use parents' fear for their children's safety, to use parental love as a way to manipulate people into doing what you want. It's absolutely appalling. Any public servant that does that should be run out of office. I mean, it's absolutely also what you say, disingenuous. It undermines faith in these institutions. Why should anyone believe the New York Health Commissioner now about anything when she's saying, oh, the cases have quadrupled to 50 statewide? That's what it was. They're doing the same thing here in Texas, saying, oh, cases have quadrupled from 75 to 220 in a state of 28 million people. So it's pure manipulation, fear-mongering, and playing on parental love for their children. It's terrible.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that we've seen across this country has been that these areas that have the most severe approaches that take on, a lot of political character to them are also ones that have seen recent case counts spike, not just for kids, but for adults. Of course, in Washington, D.C. and New York City, I believe we have the numbers for those. We've seen these spikes of late, despite the fact that both cities have obviously used some very, aggressive and restrictionist policies toward the way that they've handled the virus. What is your response to seeing this type of dynamic happen, particularly after the New York Times and the Washington Post seemed so interested in what was going on in Florida back in the summer?
Right, yeah. There's not a lot of fear-mongering about the spikes in cases in the Northeast now in these blue states the way there was in Florida. Look, I think we've been in this long enough now, 2 years now, to know that the really draconian policies, the lockdowns, the mandates, the things that some of these blue states did that some of these other states did not do, it didn't really make a difference, from state to state. When you look at the sweep of the pandemic to date, these lockdowns and these policies don't really move the needle one way or the other, but they do cause a lot of follow-on damage to the education of our children, to local businesses, to livelihoods in terms of addiction, suicide. Lockdowns and mandates and school closures and business closures do enormous damage. And these governors and blue state politicians never want to factor that into their policy making. But now they're sort of being forced to, I think, simply because they know that the American people are not going to go along with another round of lockdowns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you, John. I also think that this is going to be something where we are going to track the differences, particularly in outcomes for children, for years and decades to come, coming out of the differences and the choices that were made. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. Most politicians are liars, but looking back at a 50-year career as a politician, there have been plenty of times when Joe Biden was caught making up stories, telling lies, or just talking nonsense. As writer James Lilix calls it, it's the soft bigotry of Joe expectations. But as we reflect on his first year as president, it's clear that some things never change. 2021 was full of Biden slip-ups and tall tales, from forgetting the names of his own staff to misremembering his past. The only difference between then and now he has Kamala Harris by his side, cackling her way all the way through it.
When I became vice president, one of the Capitol Hill newspapers estimated that I had taken more than 7,000 round trips in Amtrak over my career. I used to drive a tractor trailer.
Oh, awesome.
And so I know a little bit about driving big trucks. There's a reason why it's been harder to get African Americans initially to get vaccinated, because they used to being experimented on. The Tuskegee Airmen. I'm really proud of this group. For Secretary of Health and Education Service, I nominated Javier Baccaria. I want to thank the former general. I keep calling him general, but the guy who runs that outfit over there.
Joining me to react, Fox News contributor Joe Concha. Joe, I think we've all gotten used to covering Joe Biden over his career and being used to some of these tall tales and big fish stories and the like. But it only seems to have gotten worse in this first year, and yet nobody seems to really question it. They just act as if it's not going on around us.
Yeah, Ben, it's the Brian Williams presidency at this point, right? It's not just that President Biden is a serial liar. He does it in the spirit of the former NBC News nightly anchor. He lies for no apparent reason. It's not like, he's in some sort of tough interview and then he grabs for something. I mean, what compels a president, like he did a couple of weeks ago, to say that he consulted with Golda Meir, right? He said that he consulted her during the Six-Day War in 1967 while he was a law student. What compels Joe Biden to say that he was arrested in South Africa trying to see Nelson Mandela? That never happened. And the answer is, I guess, to your point, he feels he could always get away with it because he knows there won't be any true consequences. I mean, he eventually became president after all. And that's despite, remember, his first run for president, going for the White House, he had to drop out due to plagiarism, stealing somebody else's work as his own. So, look, if Biden ran on being the second coming of George Washington in terms of trust, he's as trusted as Jussie Smollett at this point. There's a new CNN poll out, and it finds that 2/3, Ben, of the American people do not trust this president. 3 in 4 independents, 75% do not trust him. That's a big deal for a guy who basically said, trust me, I'm not Donald Trump. Well, no one trusts you either, pal.
I think there's a different standard too, Joe. I mean, we have a standard for local politicians who may tell these fish stories, and people are just used to them. They're beloved figures and the like. Oh, they've been around forever. We can forgive Grandpa for maybe, losing his set of facts. But he's the commander in chief at a very critical time, facing very critical issues. And that lack of trust that you're talking about, it carries a lot more weight now, doesn't it?
Of course, because, as you said, you're the leader of the free world. You don't have to tell these stories anymore about how once you were a truck driver X amount of years ago. I mean, why even bring this up? The Amtrak one kills me, too, because he says, well, I used to talk to this guy from New Jersey. I'm from New Jersey. And he would say, Joey, baby, what are you doing back on the train? And they used to track how many miles he used to take. The problem is when he tells the story about the guy who says, Joey, baby had been dead for years at the time that Joe Biden said that happened. So I don't know if it's a memory thing. I just think it's a reflex at this point that he just tells these stories, and no one in his communications department says, you know, you don't want to tell this anymore, because at least maybe one or two fact checkers out there are calling you out on it, at least on social media. But fact checkers, for the most part, Ben, they've taken off for the last 11 months since the inauguration, when Donald Trump got fact-checked every other minute.
Of course. It is a good example of this Abe Simpson presidency. You just tell all these onion in your belt stories until people let you out of the interview. Thank you, Joe, for joining me tonight.
Have a good New Year, my friend. Say hello to Megan and the baby, of course.
You too. Right, of course. It's clear the Biden administration has a lot of work coming in the next year, but George Washington law professor Jonathan Turley has a suggestion for the president when it comes to a New Year's resolution. In a column published in The Hill, he writes, Joe Biden could stop declaring the guilt or innocence of people before they are actually investigated or tried. When passions turn to rage, a president can bring a needed voice for fairness and patience in allowing our system to function without prejudice or prejudgment. Conversely, if the president rushes to judgment, he becomes an enabler of mob justice. Jonathan Turley joins me now. This is certainly something that I hope that the president takes under consideration. Why is it so important, Jonathan, for this kind of thing to be treated with seriousness by the commander-in-chief?
Well, you know, this has a deeply corrosive impact on the president. Is that voice of reason. The president is the person that obviously people listen to because he was elected by the majority of voters. And he needs to use that capital to really dampen down passions on occasions, to speak to the process of justice, not the result of the justice system. And that's something that President Biden has failed to do repeatedly, and that has contributed, in my view, to a lot of the tensions that we have. In the case of Kyle Rittenhouse, the president came out and called him a white supremacist and treated him as guilty. Many of the facts that were being reported were disproven, and obviously the jury ultimately acquitted him. But when it did, the president came out and said how angry he was with the verdict. That's not the words of a president. A president needs to say that while you may have had misgivings and doubt, you respect that jury decision. He started out with that type of positive message. But then he came back and reverted to his earlier position and says how angry he is at what the jury did. That's not something that works to make this a better country that supports our justice system. The thing that bothered me the most was when he came out and declared the border agents to be guilty before any investigation. He accused them of whipping migrants at the water and promised that they would be punished. And these are employees of the executive branch, the branch that he heads. They hadn't even been subject to a full investigation. And of course, we now know that they didn't whip people. The photographer who supplied that video said he didn't know what people were talking about, that he didn't see any whipping. But you haven't heard anything about that investigation. We're supposed to hear about it very quickly. The word is that the investigation was completed, and yet it's radio silence. But these agents are still on administrative duties.
You know, Professor Turley, one of the things, and I appreciated so much this year, your intelligent writing on so many different topics. I encourage people to read your website for your unfiltered thoughts on so many of these cases that have been at the center of discussion in this past year. I'm so tired of these cases dominating our national conversation when so many of them are issues that should be decided locally by juries that are not affected by national discourse. And to me, this whole concept of Biden backing off and withholding judgment is part of that, is designed to lower the tensions involved. Do we have any hope of getting back to that in our environment today, or are we doomed to have every case, such as the Jussie Smollett case, for instance, become one of national import where everyone has to weigh in and pick a side?
You know, I'm an optimist on these things, and I try to remain so. You know, the thing that gives me optimism from this year is that jurors showed all the integrity and all of the independence as lacking in many of our leaders. You know, they, in the Smollett jury, in the Rittenhouse jury, they withstood a lot of pressure, and they ruled on the evidence. We saw the Arbery case, the jury reaching a conclusion that was based on the evidence. So when regular people are asked to do the right thing, they often do. What we need is for our leaders to do the same. President Biden has to decide, is he a backroom politician, or is he going to be president of the United States?
Professor Turley, thank you so much for taking the time to join me tonight, and Happy New Year to you. Still ahead, the fight over the classroom heats up as teachers demand an additional responsibility, coaching children about their sexuality.